FYI, we are recording this for replay, and this is a workshop format, so we'd be pleased and delighted if you contributed in the chat. If you have ideas about resources, experiences, connections to make relating to the discussion, please do so. And if you're working on an AI project right now in legal tech and you feel comfortable sharing, let us know. We're shooting for about 10 or 15 minutes of QA at the end. And of course, you can always follow up with questions after the session. I want to introduce our guest yet, but I'll introduce Lee Lorenzen, who's on the call, who's my partner at PartnerMotion. And Lee's going to help manage the chat and the QA today. And just by way of our plug here, this is the 11th workshop we've had. I invite you to check out the prior workshops. They're all available on replay. We cover all kinds of issues important to startups, particularly in legal tech, and you can find that at the PartnerMotion website. We are an advisory firm that works with startups and some larger companies as well, particularly in legal tech, across kind of issues we're going to talk about today: AI integration strategy, go-to-market, partnering, exit strategy. We're a little different than other advisors because we're super hands-on. We help you figure out your next move and also help you implement it. If you think that could be helpful for you, please feel free to set up a time to brainstorm with us. We really enjoy doing that, and we can have an intro call. So let me introduce our, before I introduce Sam, real quick, we're going to do 3 broad topics today. What does the landscape look like right now for generative AI and legal tech? What tools are becoming available and how they can be leveraged in practical terms? And finally, what are some of the hard issues that are unique to legal tech that need to be considered as you leverage generative AI? And so let me first introduce Sam Kahn. He's someone I've worked with quite a bit on AI and machine learning projects over the years, and he's a perfect guest to answer our questions. Sam is VP of Data Science at Ticker in San Francisco and a research fellow at the University of California at Santa Cruz. He specializes in deep learning, computer vision, and machine learning. He has created and trained models on legal data, and he consults with startups on their AI strategy. Welcome, Sam.
Hey, guys.
Let me start off with a little bit of background and a question for you, Sam. So AI is nothing new to legal tech.
Mm-hmm.
It's been part of legal tech for more than a decade, and it's pretty easy to come up with a list like this, which has about 100 companies in legal tech who deploy AI or machine learning in some kind of way in their products.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see if you break it down, there's a lot of traditional concentration around contracts, but a growing number are talking about generating text as part of their app. And if you think about what the AI applications are in these categories, you might break it down this way. In terms of these kind of 4 areas. We won't read them off, but generative AI on the right means not just spitting out documents, but also reviewing documents, suggesting improvements, summarizing, all kinds of different ways to manipulate text. So, Sam, given this landscape and background of AI and legal tech, why do you think ChatGPT has created such a commotion now, particularly in legal?
Yeah, so I think, just to ground ourselves a little bit, GPT just means generative pre-trained transformer, and it's tuned for chat, right? The transformer architecture is almost 6 years old now, so I've been personally using these models for a long time. So, why are we having this moment? And my personal opinion is OpenAI has done a really good job of making it easy to interact with. Of course, like the key to these models they are trained on a ton of data and they have a ton of parameters. I think ChatGPT has 175 billion. And that is kind of what has brought us to this moment from an architectural point of view, from a, just a resources point of view, but it's really how easy and simple it is to interact with it. And they've abstracted away a lot of the technical details like chaining, prompt engineering, stuff like that. And it makes it very easy to interact with. Now, that being said, I feel like the more people use it, the more you kind of realize that there's issues with it, right? It hallucinates answers. There could be privacy issues, stuff like that. And I think we'll talk about a lot of those. For AI research scientists like myself, these large language models are exciting because they've replaced all of our other models. Like on my company, we don't use, one model for each problem. Now we just use one large language model and use it for downstream tasks. And the beauty is because they've been trained on so much data, there's these beautiful emergent properties, which nobody really expected to happen. So they can answer very complex queries just because they're trained on a lot of data.
So if I used to use a sentiment analysis model that I might have built, that's kind of built into GPT, is that right?
100%. Sentiment is kind of one of the canonical classic NLP problems you'll solve in like a undergraduate course. And now I don't need to show it a bunch of sentiment examples. I just say I can either few shot prompt it, which give it a few examples of what would be a correct input response answer, or I can just ask it straight up, like, ChatGPT, what is the sentiment of this tweet, right? Or what is the sentiment of this, decision? So
interesting. Let's take a look at a couple of the things just in case people haven't seen them. Here's the Bing version of ChatGPT, essentially. The nice thing is if you're doing something conversational in your app, there's going to be no shortage of examples for these. And I pointed out a few interesting examples with the Bing implementation. Here's one of the earlier players, U.com, which was, came out very early with their version of it. You'll notice in both those cases that they have citations, which is kind of interesting and distinctive from ChatGPT. With Chat, you can give the citation if you ask for it, but it isn't presented in context with the answer. But let's look at the providers for a second. You can see that there's kind of 5 that we're able to find and that we're familiar with. There's more being launched every day, right? This is really getting kind of crazy. But taking a look at these from a startup perspective, I'm going to ask you, Sam, to talk a bit about these. For example, you have OpenAI is available on Azure now, so that's available. You can use it today. Still waiting for the Google alternative to that. And here's a company I didn't know much about, Sam, that you introduced me to, which is Hugging Face. Can you tell us about how they approach it?
Yeah, so Hugging Face it's like the GitHub of machine learning models, and where GitHub is a code repository. People publish their models to Hugging Face, and they've built a very beautiful and elegant API to interact with these models. So, at my company, we use Hugging Face a lot to build our models, and we piggyback on pre-trained language models, transformers. And people, have published models already fine-tuned on legal text. There's several legal text, specific models, and this is a vibrant community of, AI research scientists, software engineers who are really passionate about language models. It's one of the most rapidly growing GitHub repositories there is. And I guess, if you're thinking about looking for talent, this is somewhere I would look, is Hugging Face.
Mm-hmm. And then 2 other players. This is a side-by-side someone did with Claude, which is the Anthropic offering, which at least in some cases looks strong and worthy of looking at. And you have Cohere, which is available on AWS and might be easy for some folks who are already on that platform. They also have a sandbox. So you've got a lot of options to explore. Now, let me frame this a bit and let's kind of get into it. Let me propose, Sam, a hypothetical legal tech application. Let's say you want to build a service that allows you to upload a draft of a pleading that you're working on, like a summary judgment motion or something, and have AI suggest improvements and changes based on the written opinions of the judge you're submitting it to, and even maybe if you have them, successful briefs in front of that judge. Mm-hmm. So call it the judge predilection application, which doesn't seem like it's out of the range of possibility, subject to caveats on we're going to talk about. But if I was a startup going after that, Sam, what approaches would be in front of me for that? And how would I think about the trade-offs between them?
Yeah. I think the first thing you want to think about is how does your use case fit into the existing family of use cases there are. I'm not personally sure if this has been done, but it sounds novel to me, or at least on some level of the frontier. You kind of alluded to it, Jim, already, but asking yourself what data is available, how clean is it, are there privacy concerns, those are those are just some of the guiding questions you need to answer probably before you even start building anything, right? With legal documents, there is, this tendency to be very long. That doesn't necessarily fit into a standard transformer architecture, right? There's been a lot, it's actually an open research question specifically around, some of the technical aspects of the tension mechanism, things like that. Like legal documents don't necessarily always fit into a transformer kind of paradigm. So you might need to do things like chaining, use a library like LangChain, or, do I want to use open source solutions? There's advantages to that, or do I want to just piggyback on Azure, or Google Bard or Cohere or Anthropic, right? There's trade-offs with both, and they will need to be tested. There's no, this is the way to do it. This is an experimental science, right? This is something that will need to be tested. And there's a lot of, good nuggets of information, especially in the past 6 months. If you read the most recent research, there's a lot of research that is showing insights into, I think, some of the legal question or the concerns around adopting large language models in the legal space. Other questions, around data are, how much data do I have? Should I further take one of these models and further tune it to legal data? Is there some large corpus of public domain information, public domain legal text specifically, that will help this large language model, this GPT or this chat GPT, perform better on my downstream application, whether that's drafting contracts or, what have you. Do I have
so the more you can find, the better, I assume. And if I could go to the SEC Edgar files and pull down 1,000 contracts somehow,
yeah,
and they were relevant, that would help.
100%, right? That 1,000 is probably not enough to fully fine tune the internals of the model, but there's this new the beauty of these large language models is something. Well, part of the beauty is something called in-context learning. So as at inference time, when you ask it the question, you can actually show it examples, and then it will improve its responses. And that's a new paradigm called in-context learning, and that is what all these large language models do. At least the more state-of-the-art ones. I think one of the biggest things that ChatGPT did differently was something that was first published in a paper called Instruct GPT, is they use humans in the loop. I think everyone thinks right now that they're just predicting the next word, which they are, and there's beautiful emergent properties that come out of the models when you do that. But they use humans to further improve the results, and that's why ChatGPT has been so good. So I think there's an immense amount of power in the legal space to use humans, legal analysts, lawyers, to give feedback to ChatGPT, because it can learn really well from that, from humans. And then a very new paradigm is called retrieval augmented in-context learning. And you need to ask yourself the question, can I ground the model in reality a little bit, right? ChatGPT is trained up to 2021. So if you ask it a question about GPT 3.5, it will say it doesn't exist, while it does, right? So you could ground these models in reality to avoid what are called quote unquote hallucinations, right? To help you give better results. And you should ask yourself, is there some type of retrieval system, or do I have a set of documents that I can help ground these language models with? So
should I think about it as a stack? Like, hey, I'm going to start with the general, if I do decide to start with the general model, like from ChatGPT or otherwise, that's been trained on the web, essentially.
Yep.
And then I'm going to put my own layer on top that provides grounding and that makes it more expert in the area that I care about?
Exactly. I think if I were going to build a startup, I would start with, one of these open source models, or potentially OpenAI or Google Bard. And then I would see how much legal data I could get, in the public domain, so I don't, mess with privacy, PII, stuff like that. And then I would fine tune it to that, teach it the language of law, essentially. And then I can start to think about the more state-of-the-art solutions like retrieval augmented and context learning, humans in the loop, stuff like that. But it's, you want to create a legal specific language model, right? So.
And is that all those activities you talked about, is that the opportunity to differentiate my service? Because all the startups in the space are going to be looking at these options, right? And they're also going to have access to some public information. Mm-hmm. What do I do to differentiate myself if we're all using the same tools?
I think, staying at this, making sure you're at the state of the art, because there's still a lot of open questions, right? Are these models memorizing? There was just a paper published, a few days ago or maybe a few weeks ago about these models do memorize and it can blow confidentiality, and they give examples on how to fix that. So I think, yeah.
And part of that's the quality of your feedback. And I guess you could invest in humans in the loop,
yep,
who would differentiate your model by making it more accurate.
100%. Yeah, I think, differentiating yourself will be, staying at that edge, I think, because a lot of the research I've been reading have, through our conversations, Jim, have been working on solving the problems I think lawyers are concerned about, because it's not just in law, right? Machine learning has a lot of adoption in the medical field as well. And there's a lot of the same concerns there. The medical field is probably a little more advanced. So, you can pull, research from there too. So, really understanding the entire landscape and understanding how you can execute these new state-of-the-art solutions. So.
And you mentioned talent before. I mean, for the startup's point of view, if you don't have somebody who's an expert already on your team, any advice on how you find that? It's in demand right now.
Yeah, I'm a strong believer that it is going to require, a high level of talent to really execute these. Somebody who has a deep understanding of natural language processing, at least the deep learning LLM aspect of it. But I think finding talent, there's a lot of places you can look. There's, AI has garnered a lot of interest from software engineers. So you can look at some of the GitHub repositories where LLM applications are being built, open source software. Look at who's contributing to those, reach out to them. Go to Hugging Face. I mean, Hugging Face would be a great place to start, right? These are people who are literally training LLMs. There's some of them are training them on legal text, right? These people are very talented, talented AI scientists, NLP engineers, et cetera. There's a website called Kaggle, which is a machine learning competition website. Most data scientists, AI scientists, who are serious have competed there. And you can look for similar problems you're trying to solve, or if there have been similar competitions, or has there been somebody who's performed very well on a similar problem, reach out to them. And then I think the last thing I'll say is, if you're a founder and you're trying to start, a company, make sure you hire somebody who is a real engineer, like a software engineer, somebody who has, it doesn't necessarily have to be a PhD, but somebody who knows how to build systems the right way, because this is not just a data science AI problem. There's a lot of communication, a lot of data being passed around, a lot of nuance. You need really good engineers to do this. So, yeah, I think that's
great.
Probably my 2 cents on that.
And usually the same person can code and tune.
Yeah, I think those used to be called quote unquote unicorns, but I think it's, there's, most, serious data science, graduate programs are in the computer science department, right? And most, all this research is coming out from computer scientists. So yes, these people need to be able to do both. As you grow, you decouple those, right? You have data engineers, ML ops engineers, data scientists, maybe people with PhDs, but at the start, you want to hire somebody who can do both. That's just my personal opinion.
Mhm. Well, let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about some of the issues that come up uniquely in legal tech. Probably at least 4 and counting. I'm going to say accuracy, licensing, confidentiality, and potential appropriation. And we'll go through each of those and talk about some of the technical elements of them with Sam. And by the way, I just want to do a shout out for David Jargello, a partner at VLP Law Group, who's quite expert in these questions as they apply to emerging technologies and has done quite a bit of work around this. And if you guys are looking for a resource to get a legal read on what you're doing relative to ethical rules and so forth, David's a good person to reach out to. Let's start with accuracy, right? Which is really what gives the legal community pause, mostly, along with confidentiality. But we all know that it hallucinates from time to time, and depending on how much you use it. Take this example, you can see, this is just wrong, right? Dead wrong, and it's wrong about something that's very important about the company itself that's providing the advice, right? So this fuels skepticism. So what are the approaches, Sam, sort of how do you approach accuracy? And I've done a lot of work with software testing with you and so forth before, and boy, how the heck do you test something that has an infinite number of hypotheticals and responses?
Yeah.
So if I could insert one thing, Sam, before you go, Jim, you've used the term hallucinate a couple of times, and maybe this is an example of it, but maybe Sam, you could just define that a little bit. What you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, we might have seen it in Google's kind of kickoff of Google Bard, right? They ask it a question about the James Webb Space Telescope, and it just totally makes something up, right? The first exoplanet was imaged in 2004. James Webb was, deployed in late 2021 or early 2022, right? So hallucination is just when it makes up things, and yeah.
Okay, thanks.
But how do you avoid that? It is somewhat of an open research problem, right? The thing with ChatGPT is it's frozen, meaning it was trained up to a certain point, and there is no way to update it. There are ways to update it, but they're not updating it, right? They'll probably take our data that we've been sending at some point and update it, but it's frozen in time. So I think there's a few ways to ensure accuracy, and some of them, and then there's probably a lot more, and they'll have to be determined empirically. But I really, there's a paper published 20 days ago. This is really cutting edge by a team at Stanford, and they show that if you use a grounding system, so essentially another system where maybe it has an index of legal documents, right? So the large language model can ground itself in reality, the hallucinations stop, or mostly stop. So that is one avenue. I think another avenue, and I think the lawyers and the legal tech startups here who use AI, this is very common, is to use humans in the loop, right? There's tooling you can build around these models, right, to safeguard your company, to safeguard what you produce, to make sure you don't generate weird hallucinations, crazy hallucinations, or if you do, you flag them, right? These are probabilistic models. Just idea off the top of my head is you could flag content that's generated that has low probability or low confidence. You can tune the internals of the model, the temperature, stuff like that, to improve the accuracy, but then you remove some of the creativity. But maybe legal, you don't want too much creativity, right? So,
yeah, and for example, if you could display the confidence level in context with the output from the machine, it helps the lawyer decide which parts require the most review,
right,
to triage, if you will.
Yeah. And I think, again, I'm going to go back to, there's a lot of active research, and if you just go read the Instruct GPT paper, which it talks about how ChatGPT was trained, there's a lot of nuggets in there, and maybe ideas the legal space could adopt, like the way they use humans in the loop to improve accuracy, the metrics they use to measure the performance of these models. So I think while there's a lot of opacity, it's not totally clear, there's a lot of information in kind of the most recent research that I'm noticing, especially thinking about this workshop, that there is a lot of opportunity for these legal tech startups to differentiate themselves when it comes to accuracy.
But maybe that's the arms race that will happen.
Yeah.
Well, good. Let's talk about the second legal tech related issue, which is licensing. And maybe we'll just talk real quickly, because I don't think there's a technical element to it per se, but state law says you can't practice law without a license. If you were going to offer some kind of conversational interface that delivered legal advice directly to a consumer, you've got a problem. That happened to do not pay. They got brushed back on that. So you have to be really careful about that element. So a lot of startups are focused on tools that they put in front of lawyers, and then lawyers ultimately have the responsibility for the advice that is rendered ultimately. Takeaway, I think, here is just don't create the wrong expectations. We talked about the need to perhaps label the confidence level that you have. You also probably want to include citations. Lawyers will be very interested in where this came from. And I'll ask you, Sam, do you think that something comes out of the Chat GPT model? Do they really know where it came from?
I would say with Chat GPT, because you don't have control of the model, right? OpenAI, now Azure, are kind of controlling the model. It's really hard to fully know, right? And these are very complex systems, and it's a very open and rich area of research. If you ask like some of the top NLP engineers, like the explainability of these models, and also not just the engineers, the researchers, is a very open area of research, and there's gonna be lots of PhDs and people researching this. So it's not totally clear where things come from, but my experience is that if I ask it to write me maybe some LaTeX code, cite your sources, it does a pretty good job, but then sometimes it hallucinates. So I come back to these grounding systems, it could be some type of citation index or something, right? So
and the law's full of citations, and so presumably you could map those together and find the case that you're referring to if it was that kind of. But that's
100%, and it's going to require experimentation. It's going to require the AI scientists, the machine learning engineers working with the lawyers to if they don't have the domain knowledge, understand the domain better. Because if you've worked with deep learning and applied it to outside of the kind of canonical, most classic cases, domain knowledge really helps, and lawyers can really empower the AI scientists to generate better models. So
excellent. Let's skip to the third issue, which we touched on a few times, but we'll go deep now, which is confidentiality. The critical concerns, obviously, they have an express ethical obligation, and of course, they can't blow privilege, right, which is a critical element and related to confidentiality. But then you have this, right, which says, essentially, what you put into the machine can remember, because that makes the machine better. So can you talk a little bit, Sam, please, about how you go about protecting this? What is the quantum of risk, do you think, that if I put in, let's take a hypothetical, I put in my client's contract, let's say I don't scrub it, it just goes in. Yeah. How could that be rediscovered by someone?
Yeah. So I think personally, this is the biggest hurdle, where the most, thought is going to have to go into it, specifically for the legal space, also the medical space. There's some easy solutions, right? But I think it's important just to first talk about like kind of how this could get exposed. And there's really three types of ways. There's something called untargeted extraction, where it just kind of hallucinates some of your PII, and somebody who didn't even ask for it, right, ends up with some confidential information. There's something called in-painting attacks, where essentially I might have an idea of this person is working with client X. I kind of prompt it in an intelligent way, and it'll tell me that, there's some interaction there. And then there's membership inference, and that's where essentially you can, query it, prompt it in certain ways to understand what is exactly in the training data. And I think there's several ways to approach this. I think if you're going to use OpenAI or Azure or Google Bard or Anthropic or Cohere, you just read their terms of service. And I think, sometimes they're going to be very, transparent. Sometimes they're not. Here OpenAI is showing us that, yeah, they're going to use your data to improve their models. As far as I can tell, Azure will allow you to not have your model, not have your data used in their larger language models. And then another place, I see a solution is, you have, say you have a startup and you pre-train your model on a bunch of, public legal text, and then you just fine tune you essentially copy your model per client. So you silo your models per client, and then you fine tune to that client's data. That's going to be more expensive, but I think that's actually a very good solution. It's more of an engineering solution than an AI solution, but to protect your clients' confidential information. There's research and ways to anonymize your data. There's research using different types of neural networks called generative adversarial networks to generate anonymized versions of your text. You can extract entities from your text. There is a recent paper on generative models where they actually give technical ways to avoid blowing privacy. They find that, and this is a different type of model called a stable diffusion model. You might have seen these cool images being generated from text recently. And they find that if there is a single duplicate in the data, the model will memorize, right? So, and when I say duplicate, it doesn't have to be an exact duplicate. It just means it has to be very similar. So these models are very powerful, but they will memorize, and they will memorize. There's more technical ways to, avoid, blowing confidentiality. One's called differentially private training, which is kind of a little more technical, but essentially you add noise to the feedback you give the model, and that protects your PII. And then finally, you can inject quote unquote adversarial examples, examples that are not real at training time, and see in an intelligent way whether you can extract that. There's metrics you can use. In this paper I was just talking about, they showed metrics you can use to measure, how you're actually doing when it comes to confidential information. So I don't want to overemphasize, the state of the art in the research, but there really is a lot of really great information in the most relevant research in the past 6 months, even the past year or two. So,
and from a startup perspective, one of the key points is to be ready with your answer when you start to get the question from the prospective client, where they say, well, tell us about your AI architecture. It's an extension of your security architecture, ultimately, where you're saying, yeah, these are the steps that we take to prevent leakage of information, and this is why we think it's solid, and you just got to do your homework on that. But one thing I'm interested in, Sam, that I think comes up for a lot of startups is, it's one thing to say, look, we're not going to do anything that potentially exposes client data to the broad OpenAI community, the users, right? That's kind of easy to do. You just move it onto your own instance. But if you have one instance for all your clients, the same risks could come up between them. Is that right? That unless you have a separate instance for every single client, are you protected absent some of these emerging solutions?
I would say absolutely not. You're not. Like, if you have a set of clients and you feed all their data into the language model, it's no different than really, doing that on OpenAI's platform. I would still, the easiest and simplest way is to silo your models, right? Have versions of them, right, per client, and fine tune them per client. And while maybe you'll risk a little bit of performance by not training on all of your clients' data, I think the risk of, having something leak out to another client, that could be company ending, especially for a small company, right? So,
but there's definitely a trade-off working in here, right? Because I really want to establish critical mass over a large number of clients and make them smarter for everybody. But on the other hand, I'm going to be incrementally increasing whatever risk there might be of inappropriate leakage or disclosure. And so part of the task ahead is to reconcile those two, I guess, and find out where the balance is that will be acceptable to your customers.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, again, like, there's no like silver bullet. Like, it's going to be empirical, and it's going to require testing, and it's going to require understanding, the trade-offs, cost benefit, and where you want to live in that, cost benefit curve.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, we want to make sure we have some time for questions. Let's just do the last kind of unique legal issue, which is, and I did not know much about this until about a year ago, that there's an ethical rule against taking your client's property. It's not a surprise, right? But on some level, when you use a client's data to train your model, the argument could be made that you're sort of doing that. And I've heard that argument made. I think it's very novel. Personally, I don't think it's much different than the residual knowledge that you acquire as an attorney as you do the incremental case or incremental contract. And so why is that different? It's just a machine is learning the things that the human would otherwise be learning. That plus the idea that it's very difficult to value the content that's being fed in. Any comment on that, Sam, or does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think, when you frame, like, yeah, humans do that, of course. I think, from an AI perspective, it's, I would say if we take the siloed approach, one, instance per client, I would almost say it might be unethical not to, feed this data into their model, because you're going to be providing them a lesser version of what's possible,
Interesting.
a worse, worse downstream application. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have heard of law firms putting into their engagement letters now the idea that, hey, we may use your data for lots of different purposes that are outside the scope of our engagement with you. And obviously a client can consent to anything, but it's inevitable that the startup serving the law firm is going to get drawn into that, and that your practices are going to be transparent. They have to be transparent, and otherwise the lawyer can't determine that they're complying with their own ethical obligations. So before we get to questions, then just wanted to say we put together a kind of a cheat sheet with maybe some of the takeaways from the discussion today, and we won't slog through them, but maybe a couple of interesting things in here. Obviously, Sam talked about human in the loop as being an element. That may be something that clients aren't comfortable with, but you have to think about. We talked about getting grounded technically as being a kind of a critical element of avoiding these hallucinations and enhancing the accuracy. And I would say from the product and marketing point of view, these are some other implications that be transparent and be explicit, be ready for the tough questions, and be able to answer the question about whether there's any kind of residual leftover of the use of the system, and expose as much information as you can, whether it's a confidence score, whether it's citations to sources, whatever that might be. Make it explicit, because understand a lawyer has to comply with their own obligations to deliver service in an ethical way. And by giving them more information, you help them do that. I think that will serve you well in the long run, and build that feedback loop into the product. And it may be that the UX of these kinds of products is one of the battlegrounds, one of the ways to differentiate yourself, because as Sam's told us, the better the feedback, the better the model, the better the results, the better the output. And we talked about differentiation. This is going to be an area where everybody has a lot of really cool tools to play with, and you've got to figure out how your company is going to differentiate their use of the same tools. And then I just wanted to put on here just something that comes up a lot in our practice, which is efficiency is not always appealing to every one of your potential clients. It depends upon their practice area, the structure of their law firm, or it's usually appealing in corporate legal, but on the law firm side, it isn't always appealing to talk about efficiency, which is really what this is about. And so So with that, why don't we take a few questions and put them up in the chat, and we'll question Sam here. So one question is, how is the confidentiality risk associated with using LLMs substantially different from the confidentiality risk of using Google search? So if you were searching on a client matter, and maybe in this case, you haven't put the client's contract into Google search, right? But you might put the client's contract into an LLM, right?
I mean, I think you hit it on the head. The key differentiation is I'm not uploading all my clients' data to a website to be indexed by Google, right? But when I'm putting them in LLM, these, sometimes I like to think of these as essentially just really complex lookup tables, probabilistic lookup tables. So, I think there is a key distinction, right? You're not, indexing your, like, you get sued if you did that, right? But you can abstract that away with an LLM, but then you got to be careful about the downstream, generation of, confidential information. So,
yeah, I don't think many lawyers are probably just putting client information directly into any of these tools, whether it's Google or ChatGPT or whatever. They wouldn't do that. I mean, they're not wired that way, right? But when they are working with a software product and they don't necessarily know where that stuff is going, part of your responsibility is to make sure they do know that, and to make sure it doesn't go into the wrong place.
Yeah.
Here's a question. Do you think data anonymization helps in that case? You're probably seeing these too, Sam, in the chat, to make the model better for everyone. Because of the nature of the data changes with the amount and distribution, anonymization is at quite good levels, I say. So this question is generally, where are we in anonymization, and how helpful is it?
I mean, again, I hate to say this, but it is going to be empirical, right? You're going to have to look at how this is helping. I don't know if anonymization is necessarily that mature from at least a machine learning perspective, but if you can anonymize your data without, destroying the coherence of your data, stuff like that, I don't see it actually hurting the performance of these models that much, because it's more the the context around the confidentiality that is interesting to these models. And I think it's the very specifics of a contract, who it's about or who you're drafting it to, is not as interesting as what a contract just generally looks like to these models. So there's a lot of, I mean, you can type it in some of the research indexes, but there's a lot of research around anonymizing. So you could have a two-step process where you have a neural network anonymize your data, then you train your large language model. So, yeah.
We have one request for the Stanford paper that you mentioned earlier. I think that might have been the instruct.
There's so many.
Or is it this? Go ahead.
Are you talking about the retrieval augmented in context learning?
Probably. But let's, how about this, Sam, if you send me that link, I'll make sure it's in the follow-up email that we send out to the attendees. And here's a question from James. Any other comparisons really between how things have rolled out in medical versus legal? Because it's and you mentioned this to me a few weeks ago, Sam, medical is even more intense in a sense about confidentiality because of HIPAA, et cetera. If they've crossed a lot of these bridges.
I think where I've seen all the research, or most of the research on confidentiality, it's usually in the lens of the medical field. What I've seen done is, how do we anonymize the data? How do we remove the PII before I train the model? So the one of the more recent methods I saw is essentially using something called a GAN to generate new versions of your documents, fully new versions, but without the PII or confidential information in it. So, and I'm sure I'm not fully up to date on all of the most recent research, but I know it's very active. And, it's not just lawyers and, the medical field asking these questions. Like, this is, at the frontier of AI right now. So.
Here's a question. In light of LLM's power to leverage data on the internet and provide immediate answers, should companies like Thomson Reuters and Lexis be worried? And maybe I'll take a swing at this. I'm just waiting for the announcement that practical law is available in a conversational interface, right? This is the desk reference that every general counsel or corporate counsel turns to during the day because they're generalists and they can't be expert in everything, but they've got to get an answer quickly for their CEO, right? So when are they going to be able to just answer? And that seems like almost trivial in a sense. Creating a conversational interface on top of a corpus of text, a defined corpus, it's a book essentially. That probably doesn't implicate the same confidentiality concerns, but isn't that kind of a layup, Sam? Like I give you a 500-page book and I say, can I do Q&A with this book? You could get that done pretty quickly, huh?
Yeah, oh, definitely. That's you're essentially conditioning on that book. But if you have thousands of books, I think I go back to that. It sounds very complex, retrieval augmented and context learning, but really it's just using a separate system to ground your answers, right? And it's a very emerging topic and research area.
Mm-hmm. So I guess maybe a hypothetical answer to the question is, yeah, of course, Lexis and the big players should be worried about the emergence of these technologies, but they have some unique assets that if they move quickly, allow them to stay out in front. Because what they do have is dedicated, deadly accurate editorial, right? The hallucinations should be a lot lower in systems that they train if they do it right than it would be if a startup built the equivalent of practical law on the back of the legal web. You could totally imagine someone doing that, but they wouldn't have the kind of editorial control that lawyers want. That would be in addition to all the other structural advantages that the big companies have. They already have sales relationships. They already have sales forces, right? I wouldn't, if I were they, I wouldn't worry as long as they stay on top of, developing the tools that make their stuff more accessible in the modern UX. The modern UX is for this at least going to be conversational as well as everything else.
Yeah, I think, just, asking yourself, like, what is gold to an artificial intelligence algorithm? And it's data first, right? So if you have a lot of data, you're in a really good spot. And then it's model size. And I don't know everyone on this call, but most of us are not in the position to train a 175 billion parameter large language model, right? So I come back to, it's probably the data. So yeah, that is not going to be the only differentiator though. I think it's using and understanding, these models in the correct way, and just, looking at what has worked for ChatGPT and just transferring that and adapting it to what might work in the legal space. So,
well, and the good news is that the rollout of these tools in a public way has raised the expectations of consumers in all areas, including legal tech. And whenever expectations get raised, it's an opportunity for startups to rush in and take market share and build a business, right? And so that's a good thing that we should embrace. Any other questions? I have one more for Sam, but if we have any other questions, drop them in the chat. So what I was going to ask you, Sam, and maybe we can close on this unless we have another question. Let's say you're a startup and you don't have much of an AI effort yet, or you're just getting into it. What are the where should I be? Like, what conversations should I be in? What resources should I be looking at? Any ideas of kind of how I get deeper in the space in a practical way?
Yeah, I think really thinking about what is the ideal end goal for your LLM application. But I think hiring an expert, whether it's a consultant or a somebody permanent or whatever, I think so you can ground your ideas in reality, right? There are certain, there's frontiers of LLMs, and then there's places where LLMs are going, and maybe your ideas are still a year or two down the road, and maybe the small legal tech startup's not in the position to be at the frontier of just LLM research, in general, but maybe you can be at the frontier of what has already been researched. And, there is a lot of nuance to legal text, and you can be the frontier of LLMs applied to, when I say LLM, I mean large language model, by the way, but applied to legal text. But I think making sure you ground yourself in reality, making sure you understand the limitations of all these APIs, understand whether you should maybe just self-host your own model, like GPT Neo X is a 20 billion parameter open source model you can download and maybe just do your own fine tuning. You'll have a better lens into what's going on. When there's some type of explainable AI solution that is, published on, large language models, you can integrate that directly. You don't have to wait for OpenAI or Microsoft Azure to give you a application to do that, or kind of a API call to do that. So
That's great. Here's a one more question from Ryan. How much data is sufficient data to ground or fine tune, if I'm using the wrong word, in LLM? We talked about grounding before. Can you answer that, or does it depend too much on the application?
Funny, that's a question I get not just for LLMs, I get it for any machine learning. How much data is enough? The best answer is the more data, the better. But there is this notion of few shot learning in large language models. So you can actually go a long way with just a few examples. So you can show it a few examples. You might have to, chain results or, whatever, but you can show it examples like at inference time, at the time of inference to help your results. But if you're really trying to fine tune, I think you should just go look at how much data ChatGPT was trained on, or GPT-3, right? It's a lot, right? And if it's just 1,000 examples, there's tricks you can use to overemphasize those examples, but the more the better. And again, I would always start with what just legal data is public domain. Let me teach it at least a little bit the language of law, right? I mean, I'm sure there's hundreds of thousands of documents. I would train it on that, and then I would think about my fine tuning.
Great. Let's see.
I sneak one more question in, Jim.
Please do.
Yeah. How persuasive can these ChatGPT style models get, like closing arguments, talking with clients about tricky issues, mediation, arbitration?
I think persuasiveness, maybe is a little bit subjective, but I think, you just have to maybe experience that for yourself. It's maybe an open question. I'm not too sure how persuasive they could be, but you could definitely just test it pretty easily. And
persuasion is in the eye of the beholder, in a sense. So if you have, I guess, Sam, tell me if this is right, but if you've got a set of things that you think are persuasive, they're written persuasively, and they're fed to the model, I presume that enhances its ability to write in that style.
But yeah, it comes back to the first thing I think about is human in the loop, right? So that was the big contribution that the Instruct GPT paper showed, is that they use 3 kind of reinforcement learning paradigm, or 2, and then 1 more of a classification paradigm. But you could, if persuasion is what you want to tune for, you have your humans, there, and they tell you whether it's persuasive or not. How you define persuasiveness, that's maybe something else, but you give that feedback over and over and over to the model, and then maybe it'll improve the persuasiveness. How much you need? Open question, right? It's empirical. Yeah, I think reading the most recent literature, you guys should really be thinking about if possible, how can I include humans? Because that is the key, in my opinion, insight and like kind of step that ChatGPT / InstructGPT made, is integrating these humans in a reinforcement learning paradigm for chat, right? Well, the first person to do that for legal, maybe it's been done, I'm not sure, but that is going to be a differentiator. If you go read the InstructGPT paper, there's a 3-step process they use. Can you adapt that for legal? Probably. Can you adapt that for those models to be more persuasive? Probably.
Yeah, it may be more expensive on some level because those are high-priced people who need to be sitting in front of it. And I assume you'll give us if I said how many humans do I need in the loop, you'll say, well, the more is better.
Yeah. So just throwing out the number, if I remember correctly, OpenAI used 40 people.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Wow. But that doesn't count the ones who were there to spot abuse. I know there were thousands or something.
Yeah.
Just looking for bad stuff.
Those are the people who were kind of giving feedback to the model. These are like experts, people who are hired specifically to do this.
Excellent. Excellent. Any more questions? Otherwise, I just wanted to thank Stephen Goldstein, Leslie McCallum, Craig Vachon, David Jargello, and everybody else who kind of helped us kind of get ready for this. And also just to say again, please feel free to get in touch. We'd love to talk and brainstorm about what you're up to. Just make contact. And otherwise, everybody, thanks very much for coming. And we'll be doing this again soon. And we'll reach out to you with an invite.